Shar-Pei, a dog photographed in 1984. I was just getting started in the East Village in New York City. Will was a picture done by a photographer named Peter Hujar. Peter was one of my first patients in New York City in the East Village in Stuyvesant Polyclinic on St. Mark's between 8th and 9th Street. Peter was an artist who did incredible photographs, part of a foundation of cultural contributions that you see here in the mid-'80s and early '90s. The cultural loss that these folks represented as we go forward into Convergence, I feel like it's important to stop for a second and think about the ground that HIV has been built on. Because as we go forward, we see that for folks who grew up in the '80s, for gay men in New York City, for many other populations, for men and women throughout the areas, urban areas affected by HIV, these were their address books in the '80s. And by the '90s, their address books were missing 65% of the people who were in those books. That sense of loss is the foundation as we move forward to think about the United Nations aspirations that by 2030, we could have a world where we have a generation-free AIDS group. And to start that off in 2020, that sets certain goals. Those goals would look like 90% of the people would be diagnosed, 90% would be on treatment, 90% virologically suppressed. This is for the world. If you live in San Francisco, that's your world today. If you live in Washington, D.C., where I live and I work at the Department of Health there, that's not exactly the world that we see. We maybe are getting close to the diagnosis, but we don't have 90% on treatment, and we certainly don't have 90% suppressed. The advances of HIV have helped the incidence go down enormously. We see the current number of new cases, however, has stabilized out at about 50,000. And so the question is, how are we going to get that lower? With that 50,000 incidence, we've seen a decrease in the number of infections prevented. The basis of a lot of this idea that we can now start to merge prevention and treatment came from this study called HPTN 052 that looked at two questions that it wanted to look at. The first was, does it make sense to start people as soon as they're positive because we want to prevent both individual progression of their own disease as well as the spread of HIV to anybody else? And what you can see in that particular study was a 93% reduction in risk. And this was land-breaking. This study was discontinued, got a standing ovation when it was presented at the international meeting that it was presented at, and 93% reduction in risk. The partner study was another study that looked at what happens if we take about 700 couples, about a third of them are men who have sex with men, 2/3 heterosexual couples. When they looked at this, and this is for people where one of the partners was virologically suppressed, the bottom line was no infections. Now, when we look at biomedical preventions, and now we start to bring in the concept of how do we help HIV-negative people not become positive, that's where we have two forms. We have one is PrEP, which everybody's familiar with, and the other is post-exposure prophylaxis, which is after a negative person has been exposed, you get treated for a month, and then that's usually a gateway into PrEP. And then finally, this group of treatment that helps prevent transmission as well. So the combination of people that we can now offer tools to treat HIV negative and offer options for people who wish to use other options to prevent themselves from becoming positive, that we can integrate that with people who are already positive to prevent their getting HIV, is very important to understand that it takes more than medicine to make that effect. We need to have complex interactions between communities, between structural elements in healthcare and economic change and housing and social justice before these gains can ever really fully be realized. The impact of this in the United States is that we're not seeing the decline in HIV uniformly throughout every place. In the South, which you see here, it's not seen the same way. 5 cities that have the highest rates of HIV include Orlando, Florida, Jackson, Mississippi, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, New Orleans, and finally the strip from West Palm Beach to Miami, putting Fort Lauderdale squarely in the middle of that line, has one of the highest of all the places in the South. So these advances that we know with technology are not occurring equally among different geographic areas. The reason that's happening is because this difference is not just based on geography, but it's based on different populations. If you take a look at men, the risk of men overall for getting HIV if you're white is 1 in 132. But if you're a man who has sex with men, that goes to 1 in 11. For looking at Hispanic, the rate is 1 in 48. But if you're a Hispanic man who has sex with men, that rate goes to 1 in 4. And finally, if you're an African American man, the rate is 1 in 20, but if you're an African American man who has sex with men, it goes to 1 in 2. So there's no way we can think that we're at the end of HIV when we have numbers like this. We have to be sober and recognize that the challenge is still ahead of us. And it's not just about what color you are, but also how old you are. If you're over 25, you're going to see about a 12% people don't know their HIV status, and about a third of those folks are viral suppressed. But if you're under 30, 60% don't know their HIV status, only about 6% compared to 30% are virologically suppressed. It's a much harder issue to get young folks to be aware of their HIV status because they don't think of themselves as having risk, and also to make sure that they're taking their medication. When we think about where new infections come from, and I think this is something people always misunderstand, most people think that new infections come from the group of people who don't know their HIV status. They don't know, so they're not doing things they're supposed to do, and they pass HIV because they didn't know. But in fact, 60% of all new infections come from people who do know, and they're not in care. They've fallen out of care. And so that's why efforts to engage those 60% of folks in a different way is part of where the challenge is. Now, when we talk about those folks who've dropped out of care, it's not just that those folks have dropped out of care, but folks who drop out of care are not an administrative problem. They're a problem that they could lose their lives. Statistics are people with the tears wiped off. These are statistics that show that if you're not in care, your risk of dying is much, much increased. What kind of humane society doesn't pay attention to that? Viral suppression rates are also a question of social systems and political systems. Here you see evidence that in the United Kingdom, 61%, France, Rwanda, 52%, the United States, 30%. How can that be? Rates of viral suppression at different clinics in the United States can all run in the 70 and 80% range, but it's different in the communities. At Kaiser, where everybody has health insurance, everybody works, 86, 87% suppression rates. At San Francisco, the same number of suppression rates, but in Baltimore, where the more clinic is, 70, 80, 85% suppression rates in the clinic, but only 30% if you go 2 blocks away, because those folks might not be engaged in care. So clearly the engagement in care is one of the challenges. So let's just look for a second about the role of convergence. How do we combine things? This is an estimate of looking at the number of new infections over 5 years, which is about 260,000. For the last 8 years, the number of infections each year has been about 50,000. If you add PrEP in, you decrease those new infections by 20%. If you add in improvements in treatment as prevention, where you're going to diagnose 85% of the people, viral suppression rates of 60%, you get a 48% reduction. And when you up the ante on getting better diagnosis and viral suppression rates up to 80%, you get down to 70%. Notice we didn't get to 100. When you look at places like San Francisco, where you have numbers like this, and this is not a model, but really a real life example, you see about 70% reductions in suppression, but they plateau. It doesn't go to 0. And that's in a situation where 90% of the people are on treatment. Why is that? Well, everybody's talking different things about stigmatization, so I tried to give you one little look at that. This is from Grindr. So stigmatization is not just from one community on the outside to another. Stigmatization occurs within communities. Stigmatization is something that affects, it permeates all of society, and it's a bad, bad thing. As we start to roll out prevention efforts, we see all kinds of stigma for people who are willing to take PrEP, to think about and think of the names that they've been called as they try and protect themselves. For the people who are positive and people who are worried that they could pass on HIV, this stigma continues. And until we really get at some of the ways to have more of the kind of life-affirming energy that we saw in this room, we need to help the rest of America understand the role of diversity and not marginalizing people. Finally, there's social constructs, not having enough food, not having enough schooling, and poverty. All are factors that affect our ability to cope effectively with making an improvement for HIV. And we've come to a point that as we design our social structures to help community-based programs deliver the care, we need to be able to have ways that we measure what the success is so that we, instead of moralizing, we have accountability. We can no longer think of prevention and treatment as separate camps. They are one continuum. There's no difference between a human being when they're HIV negative and HIV positive except for a virus. And that virus has to be looked at in prevention efforts when they're negative and then prevention efforts when they're positive. And so by merging those two things, can we get to an AIDS-free generation? It may seem that we're close to the finish line. This is Usain Bolt getting close to the finish line at the Olympics this year. But in fact, I don't think we're as close to the finish line as we want to be. We need to figure out new models so we just don't do the same thing over again, because those 50,000 infections have not changed. Merging care into community settings. So let's take CBOs and have a day a week that we offer, that we nest healthcare in those settings. We can't bring people to the clinic. Let's bring the clinic to where the community settings are. Let's find ways to deliver different kinds of home-based services. In San Francisco now, PrEP is delivered to people's home. There's programs that have looked at drawing blood in people's home and getting labs. Let's change the model so we don't have walls around healthcare. And finally, how do we look at using this incredible energy in this room? How do we get our different kinds of consumers trained to help mobilize the communities? We can't wait for any experts to come in. So finally, I want to leave you with a thought. What would happen now if Peter comes into care? If Peter was white, yellow, brown, any other color you can imagine, if he's straight, gay, trans, if he was a woman, would his outcome be different in 2016? All of you in this room know, based on the hard work you've done for the last 30 years, that we stand on the backs of all of the people who've taught us things along the way. And I would propose that the next step of the journey will not be from the clinician investigators like myself that help figure out medicines to help. It's going to be figuring out what social structures, what community changes, what implementation we need to help roll out this science, because without the work in this room, we're never going to get to that finish line. God bless you on your work. Thank you.